Today I'll be doing something a little bit different for this channel, and before anyone says anything, yes, I know this is not exactly a new concept. That said, I think documenting and journaling what I'm watching each month is pretty interesting, and Letterboxd alone was not satisfying me enough because of the sheer volume of TV I also watch. We'll see how long this lasts, but my aim is to do this for every month of this year. We'll see how long that lasts. I don't really think we need much more of a preamble. You know how this works. This is what I watched in January 2024. Let's start with the films then, and the first film I watched this year was Big Fish by Tim Burton, which is interesting with Tim Burton. I've had a bit of a hot and cold relationship with him, and this is definitely my favourite of the films I've seen. Ewan McGregor is certainly doing an accent here. I mean, it mostly works, but there are times where he does slip a little bit, but he brings so much sort of childlike joy and energy to the role, which is really infectious. It's a great film you can recommend to just about anybody. The cast in general is just great. The visual style is absolutely fantastic, and seeing Burton work with these vibrant, bright colours and contrasting with his sort of more gothic style that he's more known for is really, really cool. Next up was M. Night Shyamalan's The Village, which I was actually probably more excited for than most people would be going into it, knowing its reputation. I do quite enjoy The Sixth Sense. I think that's a really good film, and I actually think Signs is even better, so knowing that film's reputation, I was kind of willing to give this movie the benefit of the doubt, but it does end up feeling a little bit messy, a little bit just too much going on, throwing too much at the wall. The ending feels a little bit tacked on. I wasn't really that invested. It's shot really well, there's a cool score, and of course the cast is fantastic, but that kind of goes without saying when you hire actors of this level. A fine movie, not anything I'm going to revisit, certainly not Shyamalan's best. Next up is Little Miss Sunshine, which I did really enjoy as well. Very similar thoughts to Big Fish actually. It's a very warm and fuzzy film, watched with pretty much all the family. It's a real feel-good vibe without feeling like Oscar baity or anything, which it easily could have. And it did actually get a lot of nominations at the Oscars, so that kind of worked, where it doesn't feel forced, it feels sort of organically wholesome. Alan Arkin won Best Supporting Actor for this film, and it's definitely deserved. He is fantastic in his sort of smaller role. I think Steve Carell as well does a really good job portraying depression on screen. One of the best I've seen, really. Just a really good film. You kind of know it if you've seen it, the vibe that it has, and it's a bit harder to describe than some others on this list, but I still really enjoy it. Little bit of a pivot here, but next up is Akira Kurosawa's Throne of Blood, which I think suffers a little bit from being around some of the greatest films of all time, at least in my opinion. I'm a big Rashomon fan. Of course, Seven Samurai is great too. As you'd expect, visually it's stunning, and I really loved the forest spirit. That was a really cool thing to see for the time. I think just generally speaking, maybe it was dropped down a little bit for me just for being so familiar with the story already as a Shakespeare adaptation, but, you know, really good film, just not at the very apex of Kurosawa. Next up was Rain Man, Best Picture winner, of course, Tom Cruise and Dustin Hoffman. Very interesting film because it is sort of attributed with starting this trend of, you know, non-disabled actors playing disabled characters, which of course carried on with Daniel Day-Lewis with My Left Foot. I think generally though, the story's good, I like the characters, it's got a nice sort of old school vibe. I don't think it's perfect. I think there's some pacing issues and a couple issues I have with the tone, but I do think it's a good film, and it's really carried by Dustin Hoffman's really good, but I actually think Tom Cruise gives the best performance in the film. Young Tom Cruise, of course, is really, really great in this. Next up is a film that most of you probably won't have heard of. It's The Line Friction Dynamic Strike, which is a documentary made locally to me about the strikes that took place at Ferodo. It's a really interesting story, and if you can, watch it. I would recommend it. I have a few issues with how the documentary maker sort of inserts himself into the story. I think it would have been a lot better to just have the interviews and just let them speak for themselves. I prefer that style personally, but overall it was pretty well made, and it was good to see it in the cinema, especially for a story that is so important to our community here. Whew, this is a good one. May, December. This was a great film. I absolutely loved the sort of campness of this. The three lead performances from Natalie Portman, Julianne Moore, and Charles Melton are absolutely terrific. There's like a trend of films that came out last year that just make you feel so uneasy as you watch them, and this is definitely near the top for that. I like how it comments on how trauma is passed on through generations. There's also this media satire element that it deals with really well. Again, very over the top and campy, but dealing with a very heavy subject matter, and somehow the balance is struck really well. I definitely need to check out more Todd Haynes films if this is anything to go by. Now, a much more well-known film I watched was Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. To be honest, aside from the iconic ending, I don't really think this holds up compared to a lot of westerns of the classic era of the 60s. Paul Newman and Robert Redford are great, of course, but I don't know, it just feels very dated in some ways, and it doesn't feel as ahead of its time or as spectacular as Sergio Leone's spaghetti westerns. I will always be happy anytime a film uses Raindrops Keep Falling on My Head though, and I guess we have this film to thank for that. Here's a director I am very familiar with, and it is Yorgos Lanthimos and his latest film, Poor Things, which has been getting a lot of hype and award buzz, which I think some of it is really justified, even if I'm not as big on the film as some people are. I think more so than any of his other films, this has a lot to say and quite progressive themes. And of course, the visual style is absolutely unmatched. You're not going to see another film that is going to look like this, which really gives it points as well. I do think the final third of the movie does just sort of feel a little bit tacked on, and if you've seen the movie, you're going to know which sequences I mean. But overall, it was a pretty enjoyable experience, and definitely was glad I saw it in the cinema. Emma Stone and Mark Ruffalo probably should win the Oscars in their respective categories. They're both absolutely incredible. The very next day after watching Poor Things, there was a local screening at a cinema near me of the classic The Red Shoes by Powell and Pressburger. Another film I'm delighted I got to see on the big screen. The Red Shoes dance sequence is absolutely, undeniably brilliant. And even if I zoned in and out in terms of my investment through other parts of the film, I do think overall it is great, even if not quite at the level of A Matter of Life and Death. If you ever get the chance to see it on the big screen, it's a must. Now going from seeing a film in the cinema to seeing a film in 360p on YouTube, it's Naked. Mike Leigh is a director I've always been interested to check out, and this film comes at the top mainly for its starring David Thewlis, who I truly believe to be one of the greatest actors working today. And as you'd expect, his performance is absolutely sublime and is easily the best thing about the movie. The way the film is structured kind of makes it inevitable that some sequences are going to be more engaging than others. For example, there's a sequence where Johnny meets a security guard and they have this very sort of philosophical debate, which is just incredible. And then there are other sequences where he meets other characters and they just don't quite have the same spark. It's a very pessimistic and deeply uncomfortable film, but it does actually have a lot to say about society, and I do think it has more good than bad, even if I don't think it really holds together as a whole a lot of the time. My only rewatch of the month was one that has been due for a while, and that was Inside Llewyn Davis, one of my all-time favourite films, probably my favourite Coen Brothers movie. I will probably make a video series on this film because I really want to dive in and analyse it, so I'll keep what I'm saying here quite brief. But what it has to say about being a struggling artist and about having depression is pretty much unmatched in any film. It just tackles the subjects so well. In fact, they're tackling these ideas so well that they must be coming from a personal place. And if the Coen brothers have imposter syndrome like this, well, there's hope for us all. Then I watched Saltburn, which is a hard film to even comprehend and talk about. There are parts of it I loved. I think when it really went in for the absurd comedy, it's absolutely a riot. And it is kind of messy by design, but the messiness was a bit off-putting to me at times. And there is also a fine line when you use shock value, and I think at times in this film it really does overdo it. I think overall it was a fun watch, but I don't really know how good I think it is. I may have to revisit it, but I'm not sure how much I want to. Interesting but very flawed film. Next up was my first experience of Alexander Payne. I watched Sideways, which is a really endearing film as well. Paul Giamatti is fantastic in the main role and was somehow snubbed in the Oscars that year. I really hated Thomas Hayden Church's character, but I guess that was kind of the point. But still, couldn't stand him. Every time he's on screen, I was getting annoyed. And it's the sign of a good screenplay that a lot of the dialogue is about wine, and I don't drink alcohol at all, and I still found this film compelling. Then, the next day, I watched Alexander Payne's new film, The Holdovers, which I think is better than Sideways, and I thought Sideways was great. It's got this real strong emotional core. I do hope Paul Giamatti takes home the Oscar for Best Actor. I think he deserves it. I think Davine Joy Randolph deserves Best Supporting Actress. And if I'm being honest, I think Dominic Sessa was robbed. He was absolutely fantastic and deserved to be in the Best Supporting Actor nominees. If you haven't had the chance to see this yet, go see it. It's the perfect time of year to watch it. It's so cozy and it's so warm. Just a great film that left me feeling really good after watching it. Then I watched Office Space, which I think is a really interesting film. I think the way in which it presents the experience of office workers is pretty unique. I guess the main issue I had with it is that it's a comedy, and I didn't really laugh much. Comedy is so subjective that, I don't really want to judge the film too much on that. And I do think it had good performances, and it was solid. I just never really was feeling it as a great film. Then I watched Past Lives, which of course is a Best Picture nominee. Really great film, really emotional core to it. I love when a film can present an experience that is so specific, but also can feel quite universal. A lot has been said about its autobiographical nature, and I think that really makes a lot of sense. It feels deeply personal. One other thing, the original score, absolutely brilliant, should have been nominated at the Oscars. It's absolutely intoxicating. And while I did really, really like it, I think a film that I watched afterwards has really sort of taken all the thinking time that I had for this film away from it, unfortunately. And that is All of Us Strangers, which I actually watched last night as of recording this on the 31st of January. Wow. I haven't stopped thinking about this film since it ended, and it only really goes up in my estimation the more I think about it. I know it's not released everywhere yet, but as soon as you can, please go see it. Andrew Scott gives one of, if not the best performance of the year. The soundtrack is great, both score and songs taken from elsewhere. It looks incredible, it's dealing with a lot of different, very heavy themes. And what I love so much about it is that it only comes in at under 2 hours, and it's juggling all these different ideas and concepts, and it has quite a surreal tone at times. And yet it feels very cohesive and never rushed. And I love that so much about it. A lot of these films that have more sort of surrealistic elements feel the need to go over 2 hours, whereas this feels condensed and tight. To me, it's a perfect movie, and I haven't seen everything I want to see from last year yet, but as of right now, it's the front runner to be my favourite film of 2023. Now moving over to the TV side of things, we'll begin with Ted Lasso. I actually watched this entire show for the first time. I think I started just after Christmas and then finished early in the year. It's not exactly the most challenging show in the world, but that's not what it's going for. It's a very easy watch, it has a very feel-good vibe. I just enjoyed watching it, and even after it ended, I found myself missing the characters. And that's what it nails most. It has a deep roster of characters, all of which bring their own unique charm to the show. My personal favourites are Higgins and Coach Beard, but, if you want to say your favourites, Ted, or Rebecca, or Keeley, or Roy, I totally get it. Most of the main characters have a very distinct arc, and even though I have some issues with Season 2 and 3 and a couple of different storylines that they go with, I think mostly it's just a really good package. If you like your stuff soppy and warm, but also funny and entertaining, you can go a lot worse than Ted Lasso. I also watched the Captains of the World documentary on Netflix, which was documenting the 2022 World Cup. I'm a big football fan, especially international football, so hearing this was coming out had me hyped. Even Gareth Bale and Wales get a very small section that got me really emotional, since it was the first World Cup we've been to since 1958, which of course I don't remember. The documentary does a really good job of balancing narrative whilst also having interviews with a lot of the different captains throughout the tournament. It fits a lot of teams' perspectives into each episode. It also offers a lot of behind the scenes content, a lot of which I wasn't really familiar with, even though I followed this tournament so closely. It's one of those things, if you like football and you loved the last World Cup, you're probably going to love this. If you don't like football, maybe skip it, maybe watch it, I don't know, you're probably going to get less out of it than I would. And just like most of Britain, I was hooked on The Traitors Series 2. Now, I'm being honest here, I do not watch reality TV. I watched The Traitors Series 1 after it had aired and I was skeptical, but I really, really enjoyed it. And if anything, The Traitors Series 2 expands on it, fixes a few things that didn't work, and is a better overall experience with, if I'm being honest, more entertaining players overall. One glance at the format should suggest to you that this isn't, I'm a Celebrity Get Me Out of Here or Love Island. This has got a bit more nuance to it. The psychological aspect I find fascinating, the idea of groupthink, and when people are accused of being a traitor for being too quiet or too loud, it's just great TV. And I'm not acting like it's some kind of high art or anything. Like, yes, it is definitely a guilty pleasure, but it is pleasure nonetheless. I absolutely had a great time with The Traitors Series 2, And you could probably start with Series 2 and just not watch Series 1. Even though I did like Series 1, starting with Series 2 probably makes a bit more sense just because it's more fresh. And I do think there are more excellent moments in Series 2. I've also been watching The Fast Show, which is an old sketch show from the 90s from the UK. Really, really enjoy that as well. Some great sketches. Some that I'm really never going to forget. Bob Fleming's Country Favourites is just one of my favourite things ever, and I've sent it to most people I know. If you haven't watched it, check it out. It's so funny. I haven't quite finished the show yet as of recording, but I probably will have in the next couple days. Really great sketch show. I don't think it's quite up there with my favourite sketch shows, but still, good stuff. I also watched the Apple TV show Shrinking with a very sort of unexpected double-headed casting of Jason Segel and Harrison Ford. It's sort of a dramedy, but I would say it leans more into the comedy side, and at times I did think it was a little bit too lighthearted for the subject matter it was going for. What's cool though is that I think the ending of season 1 kind of implies that we're going a bit darker in season 2, which I would be all for. And seeing Harrison Ford actually seem to care about a role he's playing for the first time in like 2 decades, it's pretty great. Also on Apple TV, I watched the sci-fi show Silo, which I thought was okay. I think the premise is very promising. The first couple episodes are great, and then it just sags a lot. I think it's definitely longer than it needs to be. Rebecca Ferguson's American accent is, bless her, great actress, but terrible, terrible American accent. But the finale does set up season 2 very well. Kind of the same deal with Shrinking, but I think Shrinking was more enjoyable overall. The finale of season 1 of Silo has me very intrigued to where we're going with season 2, even if season 1 wasn't great. I also watched the first 2 seasons of Reservation Dogs before deciding that I didn't want to watch anymore. Not because it was bad, but more because I quite liked season 1 and how it explored the characters. And then season 2 just felt like it was like killing time for most of it. There were a lot of sort of very petulant teenage arguments going on that basically dragged out for the whole season. And I get that it's a very accurate representation of teenagers, but it still was annoying me. The show has done a lot of good though for representation for Native American people, and there are some good performances in there. I think Devery Jacobs is great, especially for her age, in this sort of leading role here. And my boy Zal McClarnon is great in a much more comedic and goofy role than as Hansi Dent in Fargo Season 2. Overall, the humour of Reservation Dogs just not really for me is what it's come down to at the end of the day. And finally, Blue Eye Samurai, which, again, as of recording, I've not quite finished. A couple episodes left, but this is just a great animation on Netflix. So pretty, just visual eye candy. It's actually got a great story too. I'm not usually into... I like animation, but it's not really my go-to. But this is an exception, and I'm excited to see more, which I probably will after I record this voiceover. So there you have it. That is everything I watched in January. The best film I watched was probably All of Us Strangers, if we're not counting the rewatch of Inside Llewyn Davis. The best show, probably Captains of the World was probably my favourite. The Traitors is close there as well. Also Ted Lasso. A lot of good stuff. I'm excited to get into February and do this again in a month and see what I've got then. Let me know what your favourite films that you watched in January were and what your favourite films of the ones that I listed. Like, subscribe,